everyone. Delighted to be back at the Arab Strategy Forum. I'm Ian Bremmer, I think you know that. We have some time to talk about megatrends, the state of the world in 2018. Let me start with the biggest megatrend, the thing that's going to matter the most to all of us. In my life, I've witnessed two speeches by world leaders that have made a fundamental difference in how we think about the world order. Two. The first was when Mikhail Gorbachev declared the end of the Soviet Union. You remember that? Back in Christmas time, I think in 1991. The second speech was just a couple months ago. It was Xi Jinping at the end of the 19th Party Congress. 3.5 hours long. How many watched it? I didn't either. I don't blame you. 3.5 hours long, but it was the first time that a Chinese leader in the modern era ever stood up and publicly said, "We are ready to lead. We're not too small. We're not too poor. We are prepared to be a global superpower." And today, in a world where we don't have leadership on trade or on climate or on politics, the Chinese are prepared to do a lot more. That's a really big deal. And the fact that it wasn't big news in the United States is part of why it's a big deal. Because the Americans don't care all that much. All of this instability that we see, whether it's the Russians coming in and declaring victory in Syria, whether it's the change in the balance in the South China Sea, the average American not particularly impacted by it. Since Trump became president, and I was here last year, people were hopeful about Trump, people happy about Trump. He came to Riyadh, that was his first visit. People saying Trump's going to be good for us. I'm not so sure that's true. But there's no question that Trump's presidency provided more space for the Chinese to play the role they are now playing. I don't think Xi Jinping gives that speech if it isn't for America first and President Trump. I think he waits for longer. But when the United States pulls out of the Paris Climate Accord, and even Syria and Nicaragua are now part of it, so the U.S. is all by itself. When the U.S. pulls out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, when the U.S. pulls out of UNESCO, when the U.S. recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and you saw at the Security Council last week, every other country was against the United States. Everyone. It's so hard to get unity these days. It's nice that Trump can help with that. But when that happens, right, the ability of the Chinese with a strong leader, Xi Jinping, the strongest leader that they have had since Mao, who has now consolidated power domestically, the ability they have to go to the rest of the world and say, we have a strong model, we're going to write checks, we're going to make a difference. That's the biggest megatrend out there. Nothing else is close. Now, I would argue that the strength of the Chinese government to use its economy around the world is already greater than that of the United States. Let's be clear. The U.S. economy is bigger, the U.S. economy is stronger, but it's not the U.S. government. China's only 62% of U.S. GDP right now, but that 62% is directed by Beijing. I was at the Trans-Pacific, the APEC summit in Vietnam just a few weeks ago, and I met with a lot of the leaders there. I met with the president of Peru, who I like a great deal. He is 1/3 trade with Europe, 1/3 with China, 1/3 with the US. But if you ask the future of his economy, it's more towards China. You know why? Because when the Americans tell him, do this, if he doesn't do it, it doesn't matter much. If the Chinese say, do this, and you don't do it, you're not going to see Chinese tourists going to Peru. You're not going to see Chinese infrastructure. You're not going to see Chinese companies. The state capitalism of China, the fact that the Chinese are getting wealthier, but they're not reforming their political system, and they don't need to. Americans presumed for such a long time, for decades, we presumed that when they got wealthy, China would either need to be more like us, or they would fall apart. Looking at 2018, they will not fall apart, and they will not look more like the United States of America. And that is going to drive a lot of countries to align themselves economically more with Beijing than with Washington. 2 more points on China that I'll raise, and then I'll move to some other issues. One is, do not underestimate the ability of the Chinese to use and hire inefficient labor, something that's important in this part of the world too. We see that increasingly it's not globalization that's taking away jobs, it's automation. It's the 4th industrial revolution, right? It's industrial robots, it's AI. There's a great story about Milton Friedman, the Nobel economist, going to China some 40 years ago. And he sees a canal being built, and thousands of Chinese laborers, and they're using shovels and axes to build this canal. No cranes, no bulldozers. It doesn't look like Dubai at all. And so he asks his Communist Party guy, he said, how come you're not using proper machinery? You could do this a lot faster. And he said, you don't understand. He said, we need to keep these people employed, so that's why we use the shovels. So Milton Friedman says, aha, I've got a great idea. Instead of using shovels, why don't you use spoons? Because then you could employ a lot more of these people. Now, that we laugh, right? Because you see the inefficient Chinese. But the average Chinese is not interested in efficiency. The average Chinese is interested in a job and being paid fairly for a job. You know what? Little secret. That is also true of the average American. I grew up in the projects outside Boston, Massachusetts. There are no capitalists where I grew up, because to be a capitalist, you need capital. And when I hear Nancy Pelosi a few weeks ago criticizing Bernie Sanders and saying he's a socialist, but we're a capitalist country, the average American is not a capitalist. The average American just wants a job. They want to be paid fairly for it. So if today the average American does not feel good about the future of the government's ability to ensure that they have a livelihood, that the American dream will work for them, then the American system is going to start to suffer. If the average Chinese feels that the Chinese dream is going to apply to them because they will have jobs, even if they're inefficient, that's an advantage. In a world where labor is becoming more inefficient and where automation is creating new jobs that the people with the old jobs don't have the skills for, do not underestimate the incredible importance of the Chinese government to lead not only the world in industrial robots, but also to lead the world in the employment of inefficient labor, which will create more stability. Final point on China. There's a really interesting thing happening in the world right now. It's unprecedented. We're doing a real-time social experiment on all of our children. We're telling them all here, You all have them. I see them. Take this, all of you, right? We're saying we want you to use it to communicate with everyone all the time. Use it with your friends, with your family, on the school, to buy stuff. Here you go. And use it, and then let's see what happens when you grow up in 20 years. Let's see how it affects you as a human being. It's an experiment, right? Here's what's interesting, and it's going to become much more immersive when augmented reality comes in 5 years. The new generation, they'll be on these things basically full time, one way or the other. I'm not enormously optimistic about this, but it is what it is. We can't stop it. The reason it's important is because in the West, right, the institutions that control this, that control what you see and how you interact, they're companies like Amazon and Apple and Google and Facebook. They're mostly American companies. They're making a lot of money. And they only want one thing for our children. They just want to make sure that our children use these to consume better. They want to make them better consumers. They want them on these all the time, liking things, seeing things, buying things, getting that data so they can buy stuff, right? In China, the institution that controls these is the government. And the government does want you to buy stuff. But they're much more interested in making sure that you behave in a certain way as citizens, being aligned with what the country wants, which what keeps the country stable. It's one organization. And I would also argue that this technological revolution is going to make China more stable than it otherwise would be. That's important. So I'm not surprised when I see that the Chinese have decided that AI is their most important strategic sector, and they intend to be a winner globally in the next decade in AI. And they're already ahead of the Americans in some areas, like big data, like digital commerce. I'm not convinced the Chinese will win. There are more Chinese AI scientists in America than in China, because they want our schools, they want to breathe better air, they want to have access to better services. I get that. But the interesting thing is that in 10 years' time, if the Americans are winning, it's not Washington. It's Facebook and Apple and the rest. And are those American companies? Or are they just companies that happen to be based in the US? Are they patriotic? I'll tell you a little secret. In the last 30, 40 years, there were companies in the US like Lockheed and Raytheon that were strategic to America. They were more important to the United States national security than any other company. And as a consequence of that, the US government did not treat them as companies. They treated them as strategic assets that needed to be guarded against and only allowed to sell to the US and to allies. Now, I would argue that in the next 10 years, companies like Google and Amazon and Facebook will be more strategic for the US than Lockheed was during the Cold War. But the difference is that the ability of the US government to make these companies strategic is near zero. They're not aligned, they don't like each other, they're competing with each other, and the US government doesn't understand the technology as it's moving. They don't have the lawyers, they don't have the ability to do the regulations. So even if the Americans win on AI, it won't be the US government. And that is going to fundamentally change the global marketplace. We are seeing a transformation from a regulated global free market to a hybrid economy. And we won't be able to play in all of it. We're going to have to pick and choose. That's the megatrend. That's megatrend number one. But you have me for more than 15 minutes, so let me give you a couple other megatrends, and then we'll take some questions. Two others that are important. Talk about the West. It is certainly true that in the United States and in Europe, we are seeing a trend of polarization, a trend of populism, a trend of large numbers of individuals that are saying to their establishments, we no longer believe in you. That's why we had Trump and Bernie Sanders. That's why we have Brexit. That's why we had the French elections. You're going to see former President Hollande later today ask what happened to his party. Okay, don't. That's not nice. But it didn't go well, right? Les Républicains in France also didn't go well. The old party establishment was crushed. How about Merkel? She still doesn't have a new government. The Alternatives for Deutschland, the first time since World War II, a nationalist party is in the Bundestag in Germany. All of these things are not happening coincidentally. They're happening because in the developed world, the processes of globalization, open borders, open markets have not led to the benefit of significant numbers of the middle class and the working class. In Germany, 50% of those that used to live in East Germany say that reunification didn't work. 27% of those voters voted for the Alternatives for Deutschland. That's why that Merkel, with her new government, is going to have such a harder time governing for a strong Germany and a strong Europe than she would have before. That's a mega trend. There's only one major developed economy in the world that is not experiencing this mega trend right now: Japan. Nobody talks about Japan. When I was here last year, 1 year ago, if I had told you that this year, right now, that the strongest leader of any developed democracy was going to be Shinzo Abe in Japan, you would have said I was crazy. Shinzo Abe of Japan? Not the Americans, not the Brits, not the Germans or the French, no. And the reason for that is because in Japan, the population is shrinking. So even though the economy is going nowhere, the middle class and the working class per capita feels better. Part of the reason is because Japan has no immigration. So everyone's Japanese. They kind of like that. Part of the reason is because the culture's so homogeneous. We can look at Japan today and we can say that it's basically a stable single-party democracy. Now, I'm not standing here and saying immigration is bad. I'm certainly not saying that. But I'm saying that if you don't give reasons for the middle and the working class to believe that immigration will help you, they will say it's bad. And they'll vote that way. And we're seeing that across the developed world. Here's the mega trend. The mega trend is it won't affect the politics. The mega trend is that in 2018, this is not a crisis. It's a chronic condition. God forbid, if I went to the doctor, you have many great ones here in Dubai. If I left this event and went to the doctor and they said, Ian, I hate to tell you this, you have cancer. Stage 4 cancer, it's horrible. I promise you, I am changing my life immediately, right? That's a crisis. On the other hand, if I had a back condition when I was 18, and it gets a little bit worse every year, and I come and address you here, I'm completely hunched over, and you're all thinking to yourself, God, what the hell's wrong with this guy? But for me, that's not a crisis. I've been living with that for decades. I'm not going to do anything about that. I'm not going to change my life. Structural inequality in the United States and Europe is not a crisis. I mean, there are a lot of CEOs, they'll stand up, I've been on these panels, and they'll say, we must take action. This is a horrible thing. I've seen people say this stuff about Russia invading Ukraine. I've seen them say this stuff about we must do something about Syria. I've seen them say this about we must stop the North Koreans from developing a nuclear capability. We set red lines all the time about crises that aren't crises. We say things that are intolerable, that we are prepared to live with. Structural inequality in the United States and Europe is something that we are all prepared to live with. But does it matter? Not really, because no one's going to do anything. That's the second mega trend. is that this populism is going to grow in the developed world. It will delegitimize the view of these governments by other countries. It will atomize the populations. It'll make it more challenging. But it's not a crisis. It's not going to change the politics. Third megatrend, and then I'll take some questions. Let me talk about the U.S. I know that Trump is on all the headlines, right? But is he really that different? Is he really that different? If we were to just look at the policies coming out of the United States, just the policies, you know how well the markets are doing in the U.S. now. It's one of the reasons that this is not a crisis. If you look at domestic politics in the U.S. and you look at Trump, regulatory rollback on finance, on energy, right? His Fed appointments, his judicial appointments, healthcare policy, immigration policy. Don't watch the tweets. Just look at the domestic policy. Tax policy. You know what? He looks just like any other Republican of the 17 that were running in 2016. And that's why the corporations are pretty happy. The markets feel good. CEOs are all just as committed. We just saw the best numbers in recorded history from the National Association for Manufacturers about their enthusiasm for the U.S., not the workers, just the manufacturers. Just came out yesterday. Might have been today. I don't know what time it is right now, but it's recent. It's recent, okay? That's domestic policy. Now, if you look at national security policy, Trump's a little different, right? Obama, red line on Syria, doesn't do anything. Trump, no red line on Syria, boom, hits him right while he's having chocolate cake with the Chinese president, right? That's a little different. Trump on national security listens to the generals. You remember when Trump was running for president, he said, NATO is obsolete. NATO is obsolete. Then he became president. He said, you know what? NATO's not obsolete. I'm committed to NATO. Now, what's interesting is he was asked in an interview, wait a second, did you change your mind? And Trump actually said, he said this, you can look it up. He said, look, I was a real estate guy. Nobody talked to me about NATO. I didn't know anything about NATO. Now I know a little about NATO. It's not obsolete. It's a good thing, right? Here's the thing. Trump would never say he didn't know anything about trade. He'd never say he didn't know anything about immigration. But on national security policy, he consistently says, my generals are the best generals in the world. They're going to make policy. Whether it's on Syria, or whether it's on Iraq, whether it's on Israel, whether it's on Afghanistan, whether it's on NATO, whether it's on the South China Sea. U.S. national security policy under Trump doesn't look like Obama. Kind of looks like Hillary. You can ask Gates about that. It'd be kind of interesting. Now, no question, Trump can make mistakes in national security policy. He says things his people need to then rewind. Gets Rex Tillerson in trouble, for example, when he says fire and fury in North Korea. But I was talking to some of the people in the meeting on the Chinese side between Trump and Xi Jinping just a month ago. And that conversation on North Korea was not about military options. It was about sanctions, and it was about Chinese diplomacy. That was the generals taking the lead. Now, on trade policy, Trump is truly very different. That's where, with the exception of Gary Cohn, who's probably not going to be there for much longer, everyone around Trump is much more of an economic nationalist. They say America's the biggest country. We want better deals. We don't care about shared values. It's transactional. That's why they pull out of TPP. That's why NAFTA is a big risk for the coming year, which makes it more likely this gets politicized in Mexico and that next year Lopez Obrador wins in Mexico. That's a big risk that comes from Trump. And you will see that in U.S. trade policy everywhere, including U.S. and China. So definitely, if you ask me, how does Trump matter in actual policy, I would overwhelmingly be focusing on trade. That's where you see a real difference in how the U.S. is oriented to what it was. The final point on Trump, of course, are the intangibles, the values. Can the United States lead by example? And that's where the soft power, which the U.S. was already seeing ebb away after the Iraq War, after the Afghanistan War, after the Syria Red Line, after the Russians in Ukraine. This has been happening for a while, but it's sped up under Trump. I will tell you that in 2018, I honestly believe that there is an argument to be made that the American political system is in greater need of structural reform than the Chinese political system. Now, I think this is the first time I've ever said that in a public forum. And I'm not happy to say that. I would not rather live in China, because it doesn't need reform for me, the United States. I'm doing fantastically well in the US. But it needs reform for the average American, and it's not going to happen. And I think that that reality and the fact that other countries around the world are not going to want to be Chinese, but they will see that the Chinese model is a viable model, and aligning themselves towards it will matter more. That is a game changer. That is changing the world order in a way that none of us have ever seen in our lifetimes. It is coming now. So you asked me to talk about megatrends. You must forgive me for not, therefore, talking about all the headlines, but I'd be happy to touch on headlines in your questions. And I know that the extraordinary lineup you have for the rest of the day is going to be all over those headlines. And I'm going to start with this gentleman right here, and then there's one here. Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Bremmer, for a very thought-provoking talk. Two quick questions. One, you didn't touch a lot on cyber intervention. For example, you know, what Russia and China, how active they have been there, and the question of the US elections. That's one I'd like to know, you know, how that influence is going forward. Is it a mega trend or doesn't it qualify? The second thing is climate change, clean energy, and clean jobs. When that confluences with what's happening on tech, you know, in terms of upskilling, because jobs are an important issue, you know, especially for youth all over the world, but for us even more so. So obviously, when that confluences with this whole question of climate change, you know, moving to clean jobs, clean energy, whatever, is that also, you know, an upcoming mega trend maybe that's coming in 5 or 10 years?
Yeah.
So those two questions.
Absolutely. I didn't talk about climate mostly because I'm talking about 2018, so I wanted things that I felt are going to be a little bit more immediate. But clearly, over the long term, the role, I mean, I'm very excited about what's happening in solar. You already have solar power today is cheaper than coal when the sun's out in much of the world. 5 years ago, no one thought that was going to be the case. So clearly, there is now starting to be a real move to create these advanced jobs that I think is going to be globally impactful. We're not close to that in a way that will matter for the robotics and the rest yet. The cyber issue is a real trend. It's a real mega trend. We're very vulnerable to cyber. We don't know how to respond to it. The Russians attack the Americans. The US attacks the Russians. But we fear escalation. So we're very limited. The North Koreans talk about nukes and ballistic missiles. They're much more dangerous on cyber, where they're already engaging in major attacks, and we don't have an effective deterrent. If they send an ICBM towards the US, we have a deterrent. There's no more North Korea, right? Cyber doesn't work that way. But on the Russians intervening in the US elections, I have to say, as problematic as this was, as much as you would have liked to see Obama and Trump respond more aggressively, we spent over $2 billion on our elections. You mean to tell me that with $15 million in Facebook and some WikiLeaks on the Democratic National Committee, that they were able to swing our election? The only reason the Russians had the impact they did is because the Americans were as divided as we were. The way the Americans can respond effectively to the Russians is to fix our house. You need a strong foundation if you want to be able to prevent these sorts of attacks, and right now the US is unfortunately much more vulnerable to them than they should be. There was one right here, sir. Yes.
Well, thank you very much. Let me introduce myself. I am Mohammed bin Huwaydin, an associate professor and chair of the Department of Political Science, and I am a specialist on China. And I tell you, unfortunately, you got it wrong.
I warn you, as a political scientist, you only have 2 minutes, including my response. So you're going to have to be really short in how you think I got it wrong.
And I'll tell you why you got it wrong, my friend. You say China is willing to take the lead. I'll tell you, China is not ready to take the lead, and it's not leading. So your mega trend, first mega trend, is really not the right mega trend. China in 2018 will still be preparing itself to lead in 10, 20, 30 years to come. 50 years, and we have one of the Asian specialists, my colleague, Dr. Al-Madani here.
Question now, please.
My question is, just my point is that you get the first trend is wrong, second trend is correct, the third trend is correct, the third one, your preaching of the sustainability of Chinese model is not a right thing as well, because China does not have a model to be emulated by countries like the GCC, because their model is not sustainable, unfortunately.
I need to be able to respond or we're done. Thank you. Two things I would say. The first is that I agree completely, and I said this at the end, that the Chinese model is not one to be emulated. That's not what they're trying to accomplish, and it's not what other countries will want to do. The point is that given the Chinese model is showing greater stability than people thought, and they're writing big checks, more countries will align and point their foreign policies and their economic policies toward China. That's a big problem for the United States. It's a big problem for the global free market. The first point, you're absolutely right, that in 2030, 2040, 2050, China's not about to become the world's new superpower. Not even close. Not even close. No one is going to replace the United States, the global superpower. I've written about this extensively, what I call a G0 world. In military, the US still outspends the next 8 countries combined. My point is that if you look at the global economy, you now have a country that is prepared to create architecture and put politics behind that. And that is and have put technology behind that. That's new. And the reason it's a megatrend is not because we have a new superpower. The reason it's a megatrend is because since the financial crisis in 2008, even if the United States has shown that it's less willing to lead, there have been no alternatives on any front globally. I am suggesting to you that in 2018, for the first time, that we are seeing the United States still not prepared to lead, but that economically, under Xi Jinping, the Chinese are now prepared to offer an alternative for much of the rest of the world, and they are going to experience success. I think that is not in the headlines today. It's something you're otherwise not seeing, and so it's something I really wanted to address to you, and I appreciate your questions so that I have a chance to explain that to everybody here. And I'm out of time, I apologize, but I hope I'll have a chance to meet with you over the course of the day. Thank you so much.